Hey, folks, welcome back. It's episode 4 of The Carl Zahn Show, our podcast, vlogcast, whatever you want to call it. You probably know by now I'm a technology dunce, so I don't really know what to call this. And you're also, if you've watched the first 2 or 3 episodes, you probably know that when it comes to subject matter, it's just kind of a free flow all over the map. And because we're doing this once a week versus a daily shoot, some of the news gets a little stale, and I have to revisit stuff that might be from a few days ago or weeks ago and stuff I missed. But hopefully we'll be able to do that, keep it all relatively current and entertaining for you. And on that same note, one of the things I wanted to revisit just briefly, last week's episode, we spent a lot of time on the State of the Union address at Biden's general demeanor and so forth. And there were a couple of news flashes after the State of the Union and after we recorded our episode last week that I wanted to touch upon. And one of them was, by the way, watching that speech, the State of the Union speech, and the Biden that we're used to, falling down a lot, tipping over on his bike, trailing off mid-sentence, and usually there'll be a long pause and he'll go, anyway, which just means anyway, I lost my complete train of thought. And then watching Joe Biden, this energized Joe Biden, it's almost like there's 2 Joe Bidens now. And I'm wondering if before that State of the Union, they didn't elevate him, put some bolts in his neck and elevate him into a tower on the White House during a thunderstorm, because what we saw was like a Bidenstein. It's like 2 different Joe Bidens. Anyone who remembers the late, great Phil Hartman from Saturday Night Live, he used to do this great character with, it was John Lovitz, Kevin Nealon, and Phil Hartman, and John Lovitz would be Tonto, and Phil Hartman was Tarzan, or Kevin Nealon was Tarzan, and Phil Hartman was Frankenstein. And they would do this thing where the 3 of them would come out on a holiday and say, like, we want to wish everyone happy Easter. And Lovitz would be like, Tonto wishes happy Easter. And Tarzan would be happy Easter from Tarzan. And then Phil Hartman with the bolts in his neck as Frankenstein would just be a pause. And then he would go, It's kind of struck me like, this is Bidenstein. There's like 2 Bidens now. There's going to be Joe Biden, the elderly, trailing off, tipping over on his bike. And then there's going to be the Frankenstein Joe Biden, all elevated and full of himself, but basically just doing what Phil Hartman did, which was, loud, awkward grunts and yelling. Very strange thing. So, and then, of course, after the State of the Union, there was a big, everything got roiled up where Biden had called the alleged killer of Laken Riley, after mispronouncing her name, had called the alleged killer of Laken Riley an illegal. And then that just blew up with the Democrats saying, you're not supposed to call them illegals, we're supposed to call them undocumented, which was absurd in and of itself. But the part of that little thing in the State of the Union address that really got me is where Biden said, well, what about the legals who kill people? American citizens. And that's exactly the point, is we don't need or want violent criminals from other countries. We have our own. God only knows we have our own. So Biden trying to make a distinguishing point or a contrary viewpoint is actually stating the very point that most of us are trying to make, is that's why we don't want these people here. We have enough problems of our own. And think about what a monster you have to be to beat a 22-year-old girl to the point where she's barely recognizable. And then think about, as an American, that these people are around you all the time now. You're crossing paths with them at the supermarket when you're shopping. You're crossing paths with them on the street. They might be sitting beside you at a red light. That should be a daunting and frankly kind of creepy prospect to all Americans as far as I'm concerned. So moving on from President Bidenstein, talking about Trump derangement syndrome, and I wrote this a few days ago, but the great Jimmy Dore came out with something very similar to where I'm going. So rule number one among comedians is never steal material. So I'll give Jimmy Dore credit for at least part of this, but I was writing this last week about Trump derangement syndrome and how it's almost getting to the point now where I think we're going to have stages. So there'd be like TDS stage 1, often treatable with a stern chat or maybe simply comparing your grocery, fuel, electric, or tax bills with those from 4 years ago. And then there's a bit more serious stage 2 TDS, resistant to traditional treatments for stage 1, sometimes treatable with an all-meat diet and 3-hour daily regimens of Rush Limbaugh replays. We have saved a few people from stage 2 TDS using those treatments. And then there is stage 3, the very ominous terminal TDS syndrome, and this is what Jimmy Dore was referencing a few days ago, terminal TDS. And I love the notion of it because it's so true. There's no known treatment for stage 3 TDS. There's even talk of a mutant strain of TDS, much like COVID changed and mutated as it got out into the mainstream. This new stage 3 TDS is like TDS, the Andromeda strain. And Jimmy Dore's reference to it, and it's exactly where I'm going and was going to go, giving all due credit to Jimmy Dore, was Robert De Niro on Bill Maher and post the Oscar thing, where he goes off on another one of his rants. And it's like, okay, this is what terminal Trump derangement syndrome looks like. And so I think the next step would be that we start thinking about opening hospice centers, for stage 3 TDS people. We'll just try to keep them comfortable, keep the convulsions to a minimum, and try to keep them comfortable and happy while they slowly drown in their old steaming pool of self-righteous indignation, virtue signaling. Honestly, if you saw De Niro, and look, Bob De Niro's a great actor. I've loved his work over the years. I don't think there are many people who haven't, but he's so far off the rails now. I couldn't watch a film that he's in. Couldn't do it. One of the things he mentioned during this rant of his is that Trump was so evil and such an irredeemable person that Bob De Niro wouldn't even be able to play him as a role in a movie. And then I think back to many of the roles that Robert De Niro has had. I mean, he played Bernie Madoff, who stole millions and millions of dollars from elderly people, just ruined their lives. Jimmy the Greek and Goodfellas. I mean, you look back at the characters that Robert De Niro has played, and he's saying that he couldn't ever play Trump in a movie because Trump was such an irredeemable person. It's really incredible. And the other thing I was thinking about Trump derangement syndrome and TDS in general is you don't know if somebody has it until it's too late. There are no discernible, right? It's not like a cold or COVID where you have a fever or chills or people are sneezing and coughing. And the other problem with TDS is it can only enter another person's body through the ear. So the way you get infected is when one of these people, let's say you're visiting with somebody or God forbid sharing an ice cream cone, and as you begin to talk about politics or the state of the country or the world, and you begin to realize, oh my God, the person in my house is in stage 2 TDS, it's already too late because the infection has gotten into your ear and could possibly, depending on your IQ and the size of your brain, will infect your brain soon. Let's just hope this doesn't get into the water supply. Unbelievable. There's no mask or multiple masks or any amount of Purell that can save you from contracting Trump derangement syndrome. Another fine example of where things have come to, if anybody saw George Stephanopoulos doing this assault-style interview with Nancy Mace a week or so ago, just stunning. Nancy Mace is a representative on the Hill, and she's talked openly about having been raped when she was 16 years old. And George Stephanopoulos, of all people, starts grilling her about how could you possibly support Donald Trump, because the left has this thing that Trump is a rapist or a convicted rapist, which he's not. He was found guilty of sexual abuse, I think, not assault, but abuse in this E. Jean Carroll defamation trial. And I just don't think that Trump is a rapist myself. I could be wrong, but he hasn't been convicted of it. That's an entirely different thing. And, you know, all of us should think about how this could affect your life. Like, we're in this world now where you're guilty until proven innocent. So basically anybody can throw any charge at anyone, and then it's your job to prove your innocence, which is a completely different, it's a 180-degree turn of how our justice system is supposed to operate. But the most incredible thing about this assault that George Stephanopoulos did on Nancy Mace is that he was Clinton's fixer. I mean, when he was a young man, he was close to the Clintons, a Clinton aide, and he would routinely go after the myriad women who had made charges against Bill Clinton, and disparage these women and intimidate these women, along with Hillary Clinton, by the way. Utterly the worst people on the planet. And to see George Stephanopoulos, I mean, you just have to wonder what it's like to go through life with that complete lack of self-awareness. It's breathtaking. And he was really cruel to her, and I will give her credit. She held her own. She didn't back down. I mean, she's a strong person, but I wish he had mentioned to him his role with the Clintons, where he essentially defiled women. It was awful. It was, actually monstrous in many ways. Excuse me. So all of this said, I'm wondering if the next step, if Hallmark won't come out with a line of sympathy cards specifically for TDS, for Trump derangement syndrome, because I would love to write for them if they decide to do that. Sorry to hear about your loved one. You're in our prayers. Unbelievable. So we also talked about, either in the last episode or shortly before that, talked about Boeing. I'm an aviation enthusiast, pilot, and I think, I've talked about Boeing being this iconic American company, an amazing company. They pumped out B-17s and B-24s during the war, World War II. They built and created the 747, which just became a legendary airliner in terms of safety and reliability and its payload. Really amazing. And now it's just one thing after another. I'm wondering if we shouldn't just drop the E from Boeing and rename the company Boeing. Boing, there goes a door. Boing, there goes a wing. Boing, there goes a tire. I don't know if you saw this one last week. A tire fell off of United Flight 35, a Boeing 777, which left San Francisco for Osaka, Japan, and had to divert back to Los Angeles when a tire fell off just after takeoff. And they have video of it. And these are not like tires on your Hyundai. I mean, this tire weighs about 500 pounds. It's way bigger than a truck tire. And this tire just departs the aircraft. See it falling through the air. It bounced off a Jersey barrier in a parking lot and then bounced up and literally totaled a couple of parked cars in a parking lot. I mean, it's just a miracle that nobody on the ground got the 500-pound rubber halo. Just amazing. And, to be fair, that incident there, more likely maintenance issue than a Boeing issue. but it just feeds into this decline. And as I mentioned a week or so ago in a former episode, this arc of Boeing from a company that started raised to this amazing height and now is in such decline. And it just mirrors to me, it's emblematic of the decline in this country. I'm not sure what's going on there. And then you think as if things couldn't get worse. A few days later, a 787 flying from Sydney to Auckland, New Zealand, encountered what the airline called a technical event during the flight that caused a strong movement. So this term strong movement, and by the way, I can bet there were some strong movements on the plane after the strong movement. This strong movement was basically turbulence, but it wasn't turbulence. It was a technical event with the plane that caused a drop in altitude enough that 50 people got injured and some very serious injuries. And all we know so far is that they lost everything on their panel momentarily. All their, these airliners now are all glass cockpits, fly-by-wire. Well, everything just went blank momentarily. And that's what created this strong movement that injured 50 people. It's like someone punches you in the head and you call it a firm connection with another person's body. We are entering some new ground with semantics here in this country, folks. It's going to get interesting. So like I said, maybe Boeing should just drop the E and rename their company Boeing. And then, as if things couldn't get worse for Boeing, a few days ago, this gentleman, John Barnett, I'm sure everyone has heard about this. He was a Boeing employee for 32 years, retired from there, and he was a whistleblower because, and this is not some guy who was like sweeping the floor at Boeing. He was actually in the high brass of the 777 development program. So this is a very, very smart guy. He's not a dope. And like I said, over 3 decades at Boeing. In 2019, I believe it was, he came out as a whistleblower saying he had deep concerns about what he was seeing happening at Boeing in terms of their safety regimen and their inspections. And indeed, in 2019, Boeing stopped. Now, again, this is alleged, and this is what I'm reading, that Boeing stopped their inspection processes on their production line. So in essence, the mechanics and assemblers were signing off on their own work. So you can imagine where that led. I mean, think of a house builder who no longer has to have the building inspector come and sign off on his work, but they do it themselves. And then imagine where that leads. One of the charges that this guy had made, John Barnett, is that, and I think it was in the 777 series airplanes, but also affected the 737 line, which includes the MAX airplanes. 25% of the oxygen masks, they had a 25% failure rate with the oxygen mask deploying in an airplane. So what that means, if you're at cruise altitude in an airliner, so you're upwards of 30,000 feet, 35,000 feet, a lot of people probably don't know, but if you have what they call a rapid decompression, or somehow there's a hole in the airplane or the pressurization system fails, at 35,000 feet, I'm pretty sure you have like 10 seconds of useful consciousness. And that's why they always tell you if that happens, if you've been on an airliner and they do their safety briefing that most people don't pay attention to, they tell you in the event of a rapid depressurization, put your oxygen mask on first and then your child. And the reason is if you don't get yours on first, you're going to be unconscious and you're not going to have a chance. So what happens is at that altitude, if your oxygen mask doesn't deploy, you suffocate. That's what happens. It's not just unconscious, you suffocate. So imagine, just for easy math, a big plane with 400 people on it has a rapid depressurization. 25% of the oxygen masks don't deploy, 100 people suffocate. So this guy, John Barnett, had good reason to be a whistleblower, and he had good reason to bring these issues forward. And then last week, he was in South Carolina being deposed in this very case. And he didn't show up for the third day, and he was found dead in his pickup truck of a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Okay, I'm not a police investigator, but you don't have to be particularly bright to think that sounds a little suspicious. I think back to the Clintons' associate, Vince Foster, if you remember that, who died of an apparent self-inflicted gunshot wound. And they found him in a park, but the gun was like 100 feet away. And everybody who knew him said, very surprised, because he was a happy guy, super successful, good family life. He had no outward signs or no particular reasons to take his own life. You could say of John Barnett that maybe this whole thing became so overwhelming for him that he decided to do that. But why would you do that after 2 days of a deposition and a third day coming up? He's already been through all of this sturm and drang and legal stuff with Boeing. So, yeah, I would call that suspicious. And again, for Boeing, boy, the numbers, the events and the numbers just keep adding up. It's interesting that Al Jazeera, of all news outlets, so take that with a grain of salt, but they did an undercover video at the Boeing plant, and they asked 15 different employees around the plant, who, by the way, did not know that they were being filmed, if they would fly on a Boeing aircraft, and all 15 of them said no. That's not exactly a glowing endorsement of the product and the company that you work for. And so I think what could happen next, or you wonder if this is going to happen, and I've already thought about it with my own family members, my older sons and so forth that travel, are people going to start declining Boeing aircraft? Or not saying I won't fly on a Boeing aircraft, so I want to book a flight from A to B, but I want to be on an Airbus or some other brand of airplane. And if that begins to happen and that gathers steam, it could be over for Boeing. I mean, it's pretty remarkable where this is all going. So like I said, I'm not a big conspiracy theory guy, but this alleged suicide of John Barnett, major whistleblower, and to his credit, because I think guys like that probably loved the company and had a genuine concern about these safety issues that are real. If you remember, the plane that the door blew off of, if I recall, they were at just 16,000 feet, so not anywhere near cruise altitude. And it was only a miracle that wasn't worse. The seat right beside that door just happened to be unoccupied, because otherwise, without question, that person at least would have been sucked out of the airplane. But what you didn't hear a lot of with that story was that even all the way up forward into the flight deck, the cockpit of that plane, which is at the other end of the airplane from where the rapid decompression took place, it was so violent in the cockpit that it sucked the headsets off of the pilot and co-pilot. That's how violent that is when you lose. I know from my own pilot experience that anything above 12,500 feet, you should have supplemental oxygen with you if you're not in an airplane that has it, which means you have a little oxygen bottle and you take a suck every 20 minutes or so, kind of like Dennis Hopper in Blue Velvet, but with a different objective in mind, for no one who's seen the movie. And I think it's anything above 14,000, 16,000 feet, you have to have oxygen in the airplane and be on it. Hypoxia, I guess, I've never had it that I know of, but one of the first signs of it is euphoria, which kind of sucks, because the first sign is that you're going unconscious, is that you get an overwhelming sense of wellness, that everything's going along swimmingly. And that's one of the big dangers with hypoxia, is that by the time you figure out what's happening, you're already unconscious. So will be interesting to see what happens with Boeing as we move forward here. I've been thinking a lot about different things as we watch the culture kind of unwind here. And one of the things I was thinking about, and if you're thinking this was probably late at night, you're right, because this is when these kind of weird thoughts come into my head. But I was thinking about, of all the species on the planet, how humans are kind of the only species that are evolving backwards. It seems like, the smarter or more enlightened we get, the more profoundly stupid that we get. Because if you stop and think about it, fish, rabbits, prairie dogs, monkeys, dogs, like they haven't changed for hundreds of years. They kind of do their thing. They know what works. They're completely in tune with nature. Kind of if it ain't broke, don't fix it mentality. And they know what works intuitively. And maybe because, unlike humans, they don't ask themselves the big questions, probably don't see your basset hound sitting around contemplating Nietzsche on a regular basis. But they also know what works. And maybe we could take a cue from them. As an example, you don't see a 32-year-old lion son still living at home with his parents in the basement cave and getting his gazelle carcass delivered by DoorDash. For one thing, there is no DoorDash on the Serengeti plain. But more important, the mom and dad lion know that it's imperative that Junior learns to go out and stalk and pounce and to get his own meals and to drag his own gazelle carcass back to the cave. So we might take some cues from nature along the way here, as ridiculous as it sounds. One of the other things you mentioned in the first couple episodes was want to do a little segment each week called Aviate Your Life, where we talk about things in aviation that mirror life and I think make good policy for life in general, whether it's in relationships, work, just life in general. And so one of those would be the go-around, what we call the go-around. So if you're coming in on final approach, which is your last few minutes of the flight, you're lined up with the runway, you're coming in. And what they say is you should have a stabilized approach. So there's a certain space you should be in the air. There's a certain glide slope you should be maintaining towards the runway, a certain airspeed, and a certain profile attitude of the airplane. And if any of those things aren't right or are unstable, you should go around. In other words, you add power, you abort the landing, you go around, and you try again. And again, this is counter to human instinct because you want to get on the ground, you're already late, you want to get the flight complete. So there's a resistance, and many accidents happen because of pilots that resisted a go around and continued an unstable approach. So if you got anything in your life that's going on where your approach is unstable, I would suggest that you go around. And just finally here, before we wrap up, another kind of random thought. Thinking a lot lately about generational benchmarks, if that's even a sensible term, and how that evolving benchmark will likely shape future generations. I was born in 1957, grew up, my dad was a World War II veteran, as I've mentioned, and I literally spent my whole childhood outside. We were a skiing family, a hiking family, and that was pretty normal back then. Like, kids were outside playing, people were active, people did things. You created true friendships, not online, like how many friends do you have on Facebook? And we also learned basic manners and decency, just simple things like you don't start eating if you're at a table until everyone has been served, or if you're at a table and a woman leaves the table and comes back, as she comes back, you stand up until she's seated. Very basic kind of decent manner things that they seem archaic now, but I think they mean something, or maybe more importantly, losing them as part of the culture means something. So I think we see a little of this evanesce with each generation as the benchmark changes to how you were raised and how the world around you is. And I've seen that with my older boys and now a daughter that I have, and just the culture in general. And the generational benchmark, for lack of a better term, is changing. And I wonder how that will suit us in the new world as we enter into a virtual online world with AI, robots, all that stuff. This whole world right now just seems increasingly crass for kids, and it revolves around crude sexual jokes and themes. It teaches nobody anything of real value, I think. And then I wonder about the AI thing, this whole robot thing. I just think it's going to be a disaster. That's just my opinion. I saw a robot last week that's supposed to be, that its name is Mohammed, and it's clearly supposed to be a Middle Eastern robot. And it reached down and grabbed the woman's ass, a reporter's ass. So I'm thinking we already have, toxic masculinity in robots, or else the guy who programmed the robot is just a creep. I don't know. But I can tell you one thing about AI and artificial robots. They're never going to, when you can create the human eye that sheds tears and an emotion, and you can create a robot that's moved by an opera piece or music, or you can create a robot that smells fresh baked bread and has the emotional senses and all the things that go around with that. In other words, the essence of being human, then I'll be impressed. Until then, I think we're headed down a nasty road with AI. It's just, let's just say I can smell it coming. How's that for a hook? So thanks for joining us. We appreciate it always. Share, like, and subscribe. And by all means, keep the blue side up.